Deputy Speaker, this bill makes several changes to the Fair Work Act and related legislation. Most I support and one I specifically do not. It ensures road transport contractors can access workplace protections through a new industry-specific high-income threshold that reflects their actual cost structure. It fixes a practical impossibility in the CFMEU's administrators' reporting requirements, and significantly, it enables the Fair Work Commission to manage a caseload that has grown by 70% in 3 years. The Commission's President, Justice Harcher, has said publicly that this surge is principally driven by the use of AI tools by potential litigants. Research presented at Senate estimates in June this year found that 40 to 50% of applicants reported using AI to prepare their applications. Paid agents lodging speculative claims are compounding the problem. The bill responds by reversing the Federal Court's decision in Coles Supplier Chain v Milford, which required the Commission to hold a formal hearing on whether a dismissal actually occurred before it could even begin conciliation. That procedural requirement turned many matters into 2 hearings instead of 1. The bill also expands powers to dismiss frivolous and vexatious applications, creates a vexatious litigant order, allows matters to be determined on the papers with the parties' consent, and permits greater delegation of procedural functions to Commission staff. These are sensible reforms, and I support them. But within these practical measures is something that has nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with industrial politics, and is one that I reject. Part 9 creates new exceptions to the Fair Work Act's prohibitions on discrimination. It gives the Commonwealth the legal basis to favour one business over another, not because of their capability, not because of compliance, not because of price, but because of the industrial instrument that covers its workforce. A business with a union-covered enterprise agreement could be preferred over an identical competitor that pays the same wages, meets every legal obligation, but whose agreement does not name a union, or that relies on an award, as most small businesses do, because the industrial relations system, the awards and the EBAs are so complicated that it is extremely difficult for smaller businesses to negotiate EBAs. The powers are broad. They flow into Commonwealth-linked supply chains. The Minister can determine by legislative instrument additional contractual arrangements that fall within the exception. The explanatory memorandum gives no guidance on scope. The Secure Australian Jobs Code is still in development. The practical reach of this measure is entirely uncertain and will sit well beyond the ongoing oversight of Parliament. Now, I support genuine enterprise bargaining. I wish it was actually easier for companies and unions and workers to come up with agreements that benefited them both. And I continue to urge, as I have since really the day I was elected, to help people simplify the awards, because that would make it easier for people to come up with enterprise bargaining agreements that are genuinely beneficial to all parties and that would genuinely actually improve the lives of workers. But what I oppose is a government using its growing economic footprint to compel a particular industrial model without adequate safeguards against corruption that has already been documented in this system, and in a way that is going to make it harder for smaller businesses, newer businesses, to potentially access government contracts. I reject that completely. The contradiction is striking. On May 1 this year, 5 weeks before the bill was introduced, the Minister stated that the government had no intention of requiring employers to enter an enterprise agreement covered by a registered employee organisation as a condition of receiving Commonwealth government funding in the construction industry, and no intention of replicating Queensland's former best practice industry conditions scheme. 5 weeks later, we've got this legislation and it gives the government exactly this power. And my question is really, so the government will say, well, we don't have to require it, this is not a requirement, it just is a consideration. And it's like, just think of how this is going to play out. If this is something that could be positively taken into account, what do you think businesses will think they need to do? They will obviously think, oh, well, if some organisations will get preference if they have an EBA, or the government can preference them with an EBA versus others, well, I need to then enter an EBA. What do you think unions will do? Now, this is, we need to have EBAs. Again, I support this, but you might as well say that you require it, because that's going to be, if it is used, if this power that the government is intent on creating is used, that will be the difference that it makes. Now, the government has said, let's put this in an economic context. Productivity is flatlining. Businesses are facing compounding pressures, inflation, regulatory expansion, complexity in industrial relations, which this government has not addressed. Even when it would be beneficial to workers to simplify the awards, the government has failed to do this. And the answer is not more government, prescriptions attached to a growing share of government-directed spending. Now, this concern is not hypothetical. The Watson report, Rotting from the Top, examined the CFMEU in the Victorian construction industry. Watson found the enterprise agreement system had been thoroughly corrupted, what he called, and I quote him, old-fashioned pay-to-play corruption. There was no genuine bargaining. Agreements were awarded in return for cash to friends of union officials and to known criminals. Labour hire agreements were sold for up to $1 million. The CFMEU punished its enemies by refusing to issue agreements with no reason and no review. Watson found that the denial of an agreement could drive a decent contractor out of business. Watson conservatively estimated that this corruption cost Victorian taxpayers $15 billion, a 15% cost increase applied to the $100 billion big build. $15 billion. That is what happens when enterprise agreements become commercial assets to be bought and sold, rather than genuine instruments of collective bargaining. And that is the system that this bill proposes to reward with preferential access to public money. The Commonwealth grant government spending for 2026-27 is $830 billion, 26.8% of GDP. That is a record. Those billions are drawn from taxes and borrowings of Australians who expect it to be spent in their interests. Every dollar that doesn't go as far as it could is inflationary. In that environment, procurement cannot be filtered through an industrial relations test. And the Queensland experience shows where this leads. It's all very well for the ministers to say, oh, well, we're not going to do this. This is exactly the legislation that provides the environment that the minister can do this. The Best Practice Industry Conditions Scheme used procurement policy to embed preferred industrial conditions into government-funded construction. That sounds very similar to what we're trying to do here. The Queensland Productivity Commission found that the big BPIC likely reduced construction productivity, falling 9% over 6 years. If left in place to 2029-2030, the Commission modelled it could have increased project costs by 10 to 25%, reducing housing supply by up to 26,500 homes and imposing net community costs of $5.7 billion to $20.6 billion. The Queensland Government itself acknowledged BPIC contributed to delays and cost overruns. It was paused in November 2024 and then permanently abolished. Now, this bill creates a similar risk at the Commonwealth level. Now, I've heard some of the people opposite argue for this bill on the basis that people should have secure jobs, and that is a positive thing. Now, I support secure jobs, but we have an economy and a lot of industrial relations legislation that enshrines a lot of secure jobs across the economy. The government doesn't need to enshrine secure jobs through its own procurement practices. It can employ its people how it wants. It has the overarching environment for the economy, but it doesn't need to add this legislation. And it doesn't need to exclude small businesses or make it harder for small businesses to access government contracts. And I genuinely say, if you've got a problem with secure jobs, show me in the economy where you want to make those jobs more secure, rather than using industrial relations instruments, because there is a real risk here of corruption. We have seen this. We have seen it play out. And so pretending, it's saying, oh, we're going to exclude construction industry, there is a real risk of corruption. And the government has not got the safeguards in place to make sure that this doesn't happen. And I think then to provide this and say, well, we'll carve this bit out, it will be okay, is naive, and it is not in the interest of the Australian taxpayer. And so genuinely, the level of organised crime and issues related to the CFMEU, they are an enormous burden on the entire country, and government should be very, very, very cautious about going ahead with legislation that could add to corruption in the procurement of public services, and this is quite reckless. And again, I'll just come back to it. I support the elements of this bill that strengthen the Fair Work Commission, protect road transport contractors and fix the CFMEU reporting requirements. Those reforms are practical and proportionate. but I cannot support legislation that creates the legal framework to preference union interests in the allocation of public money. Not when documented corruption has turned parts of the enterprise agreement system into a vehicle for organised crime. Not when the government said 5 weeks before introducing this bill that they didn't have any intention of doing what this bill empowers them to do, or allows them at least to do. Not when one jurisdiction that tried a comparable scheme found that it destroyed productivity, inflated costs and reduced housing supply. Incentives matter. When access to public money depends on having the right enterprise agreement, you create the conditions for the very corruption Watson documented. Agreements as currency, access as leverage, corruption as the cost of doing business. And at the same time, you exclude those businesses who find it much harder to develop EBAs because of the labyrinthine complexity of the EBAs and the awards system, which the government has failed miserably to deal with. So I will not support that, and the public of Australia deserves better.
I thank the honourable member for that contribution. The question now